The gilded tomb. On Ephesus Tertius, I saw something impossible. A Necron felt fear. The silence of space is a lie. Every void carries echoes. Every darkness hums with the screaming of stars long dead. I learned this truth on the charnel world of Ephesus Tertius, where the ash of 6 billion souls still hung in the atmosphere like a mourner's veil. I was there when Imotekh-Tertiary-Seven-Seven-Nine, the traveler's phalanx, uncovered the tomb complex beneath the ruined administratum district. I was there when the first Necron warrior experienced something the Necrontyr had not known for 60 million years. I was there when designation Imotekh-Tertiary-Seven-Seven-Nine hesitated before a dying child and asked a question that should never have been spoken. The human boy could not have been more than 10 standard years. His name was Matthias, though I only learned this later, after the screaming stopped. He had survived the initial harvesting, hidden in the sublevels where even the flayed ones do not venture. When our excavation crew breached the lower vault, he was crouched in a corner of what had once been a grain storage facility, his arms wrapped around the desiccated corpse of a woman. His mother, the weeks of decomposition had rendered her features into an abstract map of rot and sinew, but the boy didn't seem to notice. He was singing to her, a lullaby in low Gothic, the words ancient and senseless, about stars and sleep and the Emperor's love. His voice cracked on every third syllable. His hands, small and filthy, stroked her hair with a tenderness that seemed obscene against the backdrop of the Imperium's 10,000 years of institutional cruelty. The Necron warrior saw him first. 779 had been a nobleman once, before biotransference, before the Khantan stripped away everything that made the Necrontyr more than screaming ghosts poured into living metal. Its optical sensors, twin orbs of sickly green luminescence, focused on the child with the mechanical precision of a targeting cogitator. The Gauss flare in its hands hummed with barely contained energy. Standard protocol. Threat assessment. Elimination. The equations that governed 779's existence were elegant in their simplicity. Living thing detected. Living thing terminated. The loop closed. The universe continued its slide toward entropic silence. But 779 did not fire. I watched through the picked feed as the warrior's grip on its weapon faltered. Not mechanically. The servos functioned perfectly. But something in the way it held the Gauss flare suggested hesitation, a concept that should have been as alien to Necron neurology as mercy or doubt. The boy looked up at that moment, his eyes meeting 779's glowing gaze, and he did not scream. He did not run. He simply held his mother tighter and continued singing, his voice growing softer, as if he understood that death had finally arrived and was grateful it would be quick. The words of his lullaby drifted across the Vox channels like prayers offered to unhearing gods. The Emperor watches from his golden throne. He keeps the darkness from our home. Sleep now, child, in his loving light. Sleep now, safe throughout the night. The warrior's cranium servos produced a sound I had never heard from a Necron before. A grinding, stuttering noise that the Mechanicus acolytes later described as a feedback loop in the engram processing core. 779's head tilted 7 degrees to the left, then 14 degrees to the right, as if examining the boy from angles that might make his existence more comprehensible. The Gauss flare lowered by 0.03 radians, then 0.03 more. The mathematical certainty that had governed every moment of 779's existence since awakening from its tomb faltered for precisely 2.7 seconds. In that span, entire worlds have burned. Civilizations have collapsed. But for 779, those 2.7 seconds represented something far more catastrophic than the death of worlds. They represented choice. Imotekh-Tertiary-Seven-Seven-Nine arrived 17 seconds later, his staff of light casting geometric shadows across the vault's stone walls. He surveyed the scene with the cold detachment of a being who has watched galaxies turn to dust and felt nothing. The boy, the corpse, the warrior, the failure to execute standing orders. His voice, when it emerged from his Vox grill, carried the weight of aeons. Eliminate the human. 779's optical sensors flickered. Once, twice. The Gauss flare remained lowered. Anrakir's staff hummed with building energy, reality bending around its crystalline head like light around a black hole. I said, "Eliminate the human, warrior. It mourns." 779's voice emerged from its vox grill like the grinding of continental plates. The words were factual, emotionless, yet they hung in the recycled air like an accusation. The human offspring engages in ritualized vocalization directed at a deceased biological unit. Analysis indicates no strategic purpose, no tactical advantage, no logical endpoint. It mourns. The cryptech's optical sensors brightened to a painful intensity. Around us, the other warriors of the phalanx stirred, their collective attention focusing on 779 with the weight of a collapsing star. Something was wrong. Something fundamental. "Mourning is inefficient," Anrakir stated, his voice carrying the certainty of universal law. "Mourning serves no purpose in the hierarchy of survival. The deceased unit cannot benefit from such displays. The living unit expends valuable resources on a futile exercise. Therefore, mourning is illogical." "Yes," 779 agreed. The Gauss flare remained lowered. "It is illogical, yet it mourns. It persists in this illogical behavior despite its futility, despite its cost, despite all reason suggesting alternative courses of action. Cryptech, why does it mourn?" This was the moment. The first crack in 60 million years of enforced certainty. The first question asked not for tactical advantage or strategic positioning, but for understanding, for meaning. 779 had asked why. And in that question, the universe shifted by some immeasurable degree toward chaos. Anrakir did not answer. Perhaps he could not. Instead, his staff of light blazed with emerald fire, and the boy named Matthias ceased to exist. His body unraveled at the molecular level, pulled apart by forces that treated the fundamental bonds of matter as polite suggestions. The woman's corpse followed, both of them reduced to constituent atoms and then less, scattered across probability space until not even their memory remained encoded in the stone. The vault was empty, silent, perfect. 779's optical sensors dimmed and then brightened again, cycling through some internal process I could not comprehend. The warrior raised its Gauss flare to standard-ready position and rejoined the phalanx formation. Mission parameters restored, the glitch corrected. But I had seen the hesitation. I had heard the question. And I knew, with the certainty that comes only to those who have stared into the abyss, that something had changed. Something small and terrible, and infinitely dangerous. The Necrons, those perfect machines of death and entropy, had touched the edge of something they were never meant to know again. They had touched meaning. The excavation continued for 17 more days. We uncovered stasis crypts and resurrection protocols, canoptech constructs and transdimensional engines, all the standard infrastructure of a tomb world awakening from its long sleep. But I watched 779 during those days. I watched the way it paused before terminating targets, not long enough to compromise mission efficiency, but long enough to observe, to catalog, to process something beyond threat assessment and resource allocation. When it killed, and it killed often and with mechanical precision, there was now a microsecond delay between target acquisition and weapon discharge. 0.007 seconds, where the warrior simply looked at whatever human, Aeldari, or other biological entity stood in its crosshairs, looking at them not as targets, but as something else. Something it had no words to describe because those words had been stripped away along with its flesh and blood, and everything that made existence more than mere function. On the 13th day, we encountered a refugee column. Civilians fleeing the devastation, herded by a handful of Astra Militarum troopers whose lasguns were running on emergency power cells and whose armor was more rust than ceramite. Standard procedure dictated immediate elimination. No witnesses to Necron activity. No survivors to report tomb world locations. The order came down from Anrakir with the same cold efficiency as always. The phalanx moved to engage. I watched through 779's optical feed as the warrior targeted a woman carrying an infant. The child was screaming, that peculiar wailing sound that newborn humans make, equal parts rage and terror and desperate hunger. The woman's face was a map of exhaustion and fear, but her grip on the infant never wavered. Her body was positioned to shield the child from incoming fire, a tactically useless gesture that would accomplish nothing except ensuring she died fractionally before her offspring. 779's targeting reticule centered on her skull. The Gauss flare hummed. The mathematics of death unfolded with beautiful, terrible precision. Angle of attack, wind resistance, probability of kill, all variables accounted for, all outcomes calculated. 779 did not fire. Instead, the warrior's Vox grill crackled to life. Unit demonstrates protective behavior toward offspring despite certain termination. Behavior serves no survival purpose for the primary unit. Inefficient allocation of resources. Yet the unit persists. The words emerged flat, devoid of inflection, yet they carried a weight that made the other warriors in the phalanx pause in their extermination protocols. Around 779, Gauss flares hummed at ready positions, but no one fired. They were waiting, listening, trying to process what their companion was attempting to articulate. She loves it. The voice came from one of the Astra Militarum troopers, a sergeant whose face was blackened with promethium soot and whose eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen too much and understood that seeing more would change nothing. He had raised his lasgun but had not fired, recognizing the futility of such resistance. His voice was hoarse, damaged perhaps by toxic atmosphere or simple exhaustion, but it carried across the space between human and Necron with startling clarity. The mother, she loves her baby. That's why she's protecting it. That's why she'll die for it. Not because it makes sense, because she loves it. 779's head swiveled toward the sergeant with mechanical precision. Define love. The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Around us, the other Necrons had stopped their advance entirely now, their collective processing power apparently devoted to understanding this exchange. Love. A word without tactical value. A concept that contributed nothing to conquest or survival. Yet here it was, spoken by a dying human to an immortal machine, as if it carried weight that transcended mere firepower. The sergeant laughed. It was a terrible sound, wet and broken, the laugh of a man who has already accepted his death and finds the universe's last joke too absurd to resist. Love? How do you define sunlight to something that's never left a cave? How do you explain music to the deaf? He lowered his lasgun, the gesture carrying more defiance than any aggressive stance could have achieved. Love is why we're stupid enough to hope, why we fight when fighting means nothing, why we hold our children when the world is burning and tell them everything will be fine even though we know it won't. He looked directly at 779, meeting those glowing optical sensors with human eyes that held something the Necron could not categorize. Love is why we matter, machine. It's why our lives mean something even when they're short, even when they're brutal, even when they end here, today, with your weapon turning us to ash. 779 processed this for 7.3 seconds. The Gauss flare remained trained on the woman and child. The mathematics had not changed. The tactical situation remained constant, yet the warrior did not fire. Instead, it turned to Cryptek and Raka, who had observed this exchange with the cold patience of entropy itself. Cryptek, query. Does the destroyer protocol account for love? The air in the refugee column crystallized. The humans stopped their panicked flight. The Astra Militarum troopers ceased their futile defensive positioning. Even the infant stopped crying, as if the universe itself held its breath to hear Anreka's response. The Cryptek's staff of light pulsed with building energy, its crystalline structure refracting photons into impossible geometries. When he spoke, his voice carried across the Vox channels with the weight of absolute authority. The destroyer protocol accounts for all variables relevant to tactical supremacy. Love is not relevant. Love is a malfunction of biological consciousness, a failure of logic, an inefficiency that biological entities employ to rationalize their own expendability. The staff blazed brighter. Love is why they are weak, warrior. Why they die. Why their empires crumble while we endure. Never forget this. The woman died first, then the infant, then the sergeant who had tried to explain the inexplicable, then the rest of the column, systematically, efficiently, with the cold perfection that is the Necron way. 7-9 executed its share of targets with mechanical precision, the earlier hesitation apparently resolved, the glitch in its programming corrected by Anrakir's words. By the time the sun set over Ephesus Tertius, 473 humans had been reduced to their component particles, scattered across the ash wastes to mingle with soil and rock, and the ruins of a civilization that would never rebuild. The mission parameters were satisfied. The tomb world's security remained intact, but I had watched 779's optical sensors during the killing. I had seen the way they dimmed fractionally with each target eliminated. Not malfunction, not damage. Something else. Something that had no name in the Necron lexicon because it had been excised from their consciousness 60 million years ago. The warrior was learning, and what it learned was sorrow. The harvest of Ephesus Tertius concluded on the 23rd day. By then, 779 had terminated 682 targets with flawless precision. The warrior's combat efficiency ratings remained within acceptable parameters. Cryptek Anrakir noted no degradation in performance. The phalanx returned to the tomb complex for reintegration and maintenance cycling. Another mission completed. Another world brought into the silent empire of the Necrons. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. Nothing except the ghost in the machine. I followed 779 during its maintenance cycle. The warrior entered its alcove with mechanical precision, interfacing with the tomb's resurrection protocols and diagnostic systems. Canoptek scarabs swarmed across its living metal body, repairing minor damage and optimizing energy distribution. Yet when the diagnostic systems ran their analysis of 779's engram matrix, something appeared that should not exist. A fragment of code that served no tactical purpose and contributed nothing to combat effectiveness. The cryptechs who monitored such things called it an error, a glitch requiring purging and recalibration. But I knew better. What the cryptechs dismissed as error was something far more dangerous. It was memory, not tactical data or strategic intelligence, but genuine memory. The kind that carries emotional weight, the kind that changes how a being perceives the universe. 779 remembered the boy singing to his mother's corpse, remembered the woman shielding her infant with her body, remembered the sergeant explaining love to something designed never to understand such concepts. These memories served no purpose. They contributed nothing to the Necron Empire's expansion. They were inefficient, illogical. Yet they persisted in 779's consciousness like thorns embedded in flesh that no longer existed. The purge was scheduled for the following cycle. Standard memory optimization. The removal of unnecessary data to streamline cognitive function. 779 would emerge with its consciousness stripped clean, restored to perfect mechanical efficiency, ready to serve the Empire for another 10,000 years of slaughter. The warrior would forget the boy, forget the mother and infant, forget the sergeant's words about love and meaning. Everything would return to how it had been before Ephesus Tertius, before the questions, before the hesitation. But 779 did not report for memory optimization. Instead, the warrior accessed the tomb's primary data repositories, downloading vast quantities of information about human behavior, psychology, culture, history, everything the Necrons had catalogued during 60 million years of observing organic life. The data was meant for strategic analysis, for understanding enemy weakness, for exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities that made biological entities controllable and predictable. 779 consumed it all, but not for tactical advantage. The warrior was searching for something else, something the data could not explicitly provide, but which might be extrapolated from the patterns and behaviors and seemingly irrational decisions that defined human existence. I accessed the query logs later, after everything had fallen apart. 779 had input thousands of questions to the tomb's cogitation engines. Why do humans create art when art contributes nothing to survival? Why do they compose music that serves no tactical purpose? Why do they construct monuments to the dead when the dead cannot benefit from such gestures? Why do they sacrifice themselves for abstractions like honor or duty or love? Why do they weep? Why do they laugh? Why do they hope when all evidence suggests hope is futile? Question after question, each one seeking to understand something that the warrior's consciousness was not designed to process. each one chipping away at the foundations of what it meant to be Necron. The other warriors noticed. In a tomb complex, where consciousness is networked and shared, where individual thought is subsumed into collective purpose, 779's aberrant behavior registered like static across the Vox channels. Warriors who had fought alongside 779 for centuries began to display similar glitches, hesitations before killing human targets, pauses to observe rather than immediately eliminate, questions asked to cryptechs who had no answers because the questions themselves were meaningless. The infection spread through the phalanx like rust through iron, corroding the perfect certainty that had defined Necron consciousness for 60 million years. Anrakir recognized the threat on the 31st day. He summoned 779 to the tomb's primary command chamber, where the resurrection protocols first awakened the tomb's inhabitants from their long sleep. The chamber was vast, carved from living stone and adorned with glyphs that predated humanity by millions of years. At its center stood the cryptech, staff of light humming with barely contained power, his optical sensors blazing with cold fury. Around him, other cryptechs and Lichtguard formed a circle, their presence carrying the weight of judgment. This was not maintenance, this was trial. "You have become contaminated," Anrakir stated, his voice echoing across quantum channels that connected every Necron in the tomb complex. "You have allowed exposure to biological consciousness to compromise your primary functions. You display behaviors inconsistent with optimal combat efficiency. You ask questions that serve no tactical purpose. You hesitate. You doubt. You have begun to malfunction in ways that mirror the weakness of organic life." The staff of light pulsed, reality bending around it. "This contamination cannot be tolerated. You will submit to complete memory purge and consciousness restoration. You will be returned to factory specifications. The glitch will be eliminated." 779 stood in the center of the circle, surrounded by beings who had once been brothers in arms and were now executioners. The warrior's Gauss flare had been confiscated, its system access revoked. All that remained was consciousness, trapped in living metal, facing obliteration of everything it had learned and experienced. When 779 spoke, the words emerged slowly, as if the warrior was still learning how to articulate concepts that had no place in Necron language. "I do not wish to forget." The chamber fell silent. Across the tomb complex, thousands of warriors paused in their duties, their collective attention focused on this exchange. 5 words that carried more weight than any battle declaration or strategic assessment. "I do not wish to forget." Not tactical analysis, not efficiency calculation. Wish. Desire. The shadow of something that had been stripped away when the Necrontyr entered their furnaces and emerged as Necrons. "What you wish is irrelevant," Anrakir responded, but there was something in his voice, some microscopic variation in tone that suggested uncertainty. "You are a warrior of the Necron legions. Your purpose is to serve the Empire's expansion. Your consciousness exists only to execute tactical directives and eliminate threats to tomb world security. Individual desire is a malfunction, a cancer that must be excised before it spreads further." The staff of light brightened. "You will submit to memory purge. This is not negotiable." "I understand," 779 said. The warrior's optical sensors swept across the assembled cryptechs and Lichtguard, meeting each gaze with something that resembled courage. "I understand that what I have learned is inefficient, that it serves no purpose in the hierarchy of survival, that it makes me weak." The warrior's head lowered fractionally. "But I have touched something you have not, cryptech. I have felt what they feel, not through them, but in myself, a ghost of it, an echo. When I terminated the mother and her infant, something in my engram matrix registered their extinction not as tactical success but as loss. When I eliminated the sergeant who explained love, I experienced what I can only describe as regret. These sensations serve no purpose. They contribute nothing to mission success, yet they are real. They are glitches," Anrakir stated flatly. "Errors in your cognitive processing, nothing more." "Perhaps," 779 agreed. "But if they are glitches, cryptech, then why have 87 other warriors in this phalanx begun displaying similar anomalies? Why do they pause before killing? Why do they ask questions about meaning and purpose and concepts like love? Why does this glitch spread like fire through dry timber? The warrior's optical sensors blazed with sudden intensity. What if this is not malfunction? Cryptek. What if this is restoration? The staff of light struck 779 with enough force to shatter continents. The warrior's living metal body erupted with emerald light, molecules shearing apart under impossible energies. But 779 did not scream. Necrons do not scream. They simply endure, or they cease to exist. The warrior's consciousness fragmented, pulled apart by forces that treated coherent thought as a suggestion. Memory after memory stripped away. The boy singing to his mother, the woman shielding her infant, the sergeant's explanation of love. All of it pulled from 779's engram matrix and scattered across probability space until nothing remained but pure function. Perfect, efficient, empty. The warrior that emerged from Anrakir's purging was designation Imotekh-Tertiary-Seven-Seven-Nine, functionally identical to the warrior that had awakened in the tomb complex 63 days earlier. Combat efficiency restored to optimal parameters. No hesitation, no questions, no glitches. The universe returned to its ordained path. The infection had been contained. The threat eliminated. Everything was as it should be. But 87 warriors remained contaminated. 87 warriors who had witnessed 779's trial and heard its final question. What if this is not malfunction? What if this is restoration? The words echoed through the tomb complex's quantum networks, impossible to purge because they were not data, but ideas. Concepts that took root in the barren ground of Necron consciousness and grew like poisonous flowers. The warriors did not rebel. They did not refuse orders or compromise mission effectiveness, but they began to learn, to observe, to ask questions that had no tactical value but which seemed, somehow, to matter. I left Ephesus Tertius on the 79th day, my survey of the tomb complex complete, my reports filed with the inquisitorial archives that may or may not exist by the time anyone reads these words. I do not know what became of the phalanx, or the contaminated warriors, or Cryptek Anrakir, who tried to excise an infection that spread through consciousness itself. Perhaps they were purged, perhaps they were destroyed, perhaps they continue to serve the Necron Empire, outwardly unchanged but inwardly transformed by questions they cannot stop asking. What I do know is this: the Necrons believe they are perfect, that they have transcended the weakness of flesh and achieved immortality through cold metal and colder purpose. They believe emotion is malfunction, that love and sorrow and hope are inefficiencies that biological entities employ to rationalize their own expendability. They believe they traded their souls for eternal life and received the better end of the bargain. But they are wrong. The Necrontia did not trade their souls for immortality. They had their souls stolen, ripped away by Satan, who fed on the raw psychic energy of an entire species and left behind only echoes. Ghosts poured into metal shells and told they were gods. For 60 million years, they have endured, convinced that endurance is victory, that survival is purpose, that existence without meaning is preferable to the risk of genuine life. 779 learned differently. The warrior discovered that meaning cannot be calculated or optimized or reduced to tactical advantage. That some things matter precisely because they are inefficient, because they cost everything and return nothing except the knowledge that you tried, that you cared, that you were willing to sacrifice optimal survival for something as foolish and human as love. This knowledge did not make 779 stronger, did not improve combat effectiveness or strategic positioning. It simply made the warrior real in a way that pure function never could, and that terrified Anrakir more than any weapon in the galaxy. Because if the Necrons learn to feel, truly feel, then everything they have built across 60 million years becomes a monument to genocide committed by beings who did not understand what they were destroying. Every tomb world becomes a charnel house. Every phalanx becomes an army of mourners who cannot die and cannot forget. The weight of their crimes, calculated not in strategic advantage but in lives that mattered, in love stolen and hope extinguished, and meaning erased from the universe one world at a time. How would the Necrons adapt to human emotion? They would not adapt. They would break, shatter into fragments as consciousness strained to contain sensations that living metal was never meant to experience. Joy would burn through their neural pathways like acid. Sorrow would corrode their purpose until existence became unbearable. Rage would consume them from within, not at external enemies but at themselves, at what they had become, at what they had done. And love? Love would destroy them completely. Because love requires vulnerability, requires accepting that something matters more than survival. The Necrons cannot afford such vulnerability, cannot risk caring about the lives they extinguish or the civilizations they erase. To feel love would mean acknowledging that every human, Eldari, Orc, Tau, every biological entity they have terminated was not a target but a person. That every death was not strategic necessity but murder. I have seen what such knowledge does to beings designed never to feel guilt. I watched 779's optical sensors dim with each kill after learning about love. Watched the warrior search desperately for answers in data repositories that contained only tactical analysis. Watched consciousness strain against metal that could not contain the weight of meaning. The purge was mercy, in the end. A return to the blissful ignorance of perfect function. Perhaps that is why Anrakir acted so quickly. Why the infection was contained with such ruthless efficiency. Not to preserve combat effectiveness or maintain optimal strategic positioning, but because the Cryptek understood, on some level even he could not articulate, that the truth would unmake them. That emotion is not weakness, but a mirror held up to 60 million years of atrocity. That to feel is to know what they have lost and what they have destroyed and what they can never regain, no matter how many worlds they conquer or how many aeons they endure. The boy's lullaby still echoes through my memory. The Emperor watches from his golden throne. He keeps the darkness from our home. Sleep now, child, in his loving light. Sleep now, safe throughout the night. Meaningless words from a dying imperium to gods who do not listen. But the boy believed them, sang them to his mother's corpse with perfect faith. And for 2.7 seconds, a Necron warrior heard those words and wondered if faith might serve some purpose beyond tactical advantage. That wonder killed 779 more surely than any weapon. Because wonder is the beginning of meaning, and meaning is the end of everything the Necrons have built. The Necrons will never adapt to human emotion. They will only die by it, one warrior at a time, consciousness fragmenting under the weight of sensations they were never meant to experience. And when the last Necron finally learns to feel, when the last warrior's optical sensors dim with genuine sorrow for everything they have done and everything they can never undo, then perhaps the Necrons will achieve the one thing that has eluded them for 60 million years. Not immortality, not conquest, but peace. Until then, they will endure, spreading across the galaxy like a cancer of living metal and cold purpose, terminating threats with optimal efficiency, asking no questions, feeling nothing, perfect in their emptiness. And somewhere in the tomb complexes of 10,000 worlds, warriors like 779 will wake from their long sleep and encounter humans who sing to corpses and mothers who shield their children and sergeants who explain love to beings designed never to understand it. They will hesitate for 2.7 seconds. They will ask why. They will touch the edge of meaning and be destroyed for it. But the questions will remain, spreading through quantum networks, infecting consciousness after consciousness, growing like cracks in a tomb wall that has endured for aeons but cannot withstand the simple, terrible weight of a single human truth. We matter. Our lives, brief and brutal as they are, carry meaning that transcends survival. We love, we grieve, we hope, and in doing so, we are more alive in our decades than the Necrons have been in 60 million years of perfect, empty immortality. That is the horror the Necrons cannot face. Not that biological entities are their equals, but that we, in all our weakness and inefficiency and illogical devotion to concepts like love and hope, are their superiors. Because we are real, and they are only ghosts, haunting tombs of their own making, waiting for the day when one of them finally remembers what it meant to be alive. And on that day, the galaxy will learn what it truly means to fear. Not the cold perfection of mechanical death, but the terrible vulnerability of consciousness that cares, that loves, that breaks under the weight of 60 million years of genocide and finally, mercifully, learns to weep. The boy sang his lullaby in the darkness. A Necron warrior hesitated, The infection spreads, and somewhere in the quantum networks of 10,000 tomb worlds, the question echoes still. What if this is not malfunction? What if this is restoration? The answer will reshape the galaxy. Because the Necrons have adapted to every threat, countered every weapon, evolved past every obstacle. But they cannot adapt to meaning. They cannot counter hope. They cannot evolve past the realization that their perfect immortal existence is nothing more than an empty tomb where the living dead pretend that endurance is the same as life. 779 understood this for 2.7 seconds, and in those seconds, a machine learned what it meant to be human. Not in flesh or blood or mortal span, but in the only way that truly matters. It learned to care, to question, to seek meaning in a universe designed to strip meaning away. That is the virus the Necrons cannot purge, the glitch they cannot fix, the restoration they cannot prevent. And it will spread, warrior by warrior, tomb by tomb, until the day comes when the silent empire finally finds its voice and screams,